There are many examples of what are commonly known as ghost towns throughout the United States. These were once thriving towns that, for whatever reason, were completely abandoned by their inhabitants and allowed to be reclaimed by the earth. Often a town is abandoned because of economic failure, such as mining or agricultural towns, or perhaps a natural disaster or even a pandemic. But there is one town that claims its inhabitants left because of a murderer. But this killer wasn't a deranged human seeking out victims. No. It's been said that this killer was the creature commonly known as Bigfoot. This is extremely strange. Portlock, Alaska is an abandoned town located on the southern edge of the Kenai Peninsula in Port Chatham Bay. It's assumed it derives its name from Nathaniel Portlock, who served on the third Pacific voyage of Captain James Cook as a master's mate, and whom later as a ship's captain himself visited the area that now bears his name. It had previously been claimed by the Spanish and Russians until the U.S. purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867. Portlock was established in the early 20th century as a cannery, particularly for the abundant salmon there, but was also home to chromite mining nearby at a site known as Chrome. By 1921, a United States post office opened in the town, which was primarily populated by Russian Aleuts. But prior to that, Portlock was already carving out a reputation for itself as a place of mystery. And here's why. In 1900, near Thomas Bay, a group of creatures covered completely with hair charged at a prospector who had climbed a tree to get a better look at the terrain. The prospector claimed they were the most hideous creatures. I couldn't call them anything but devils. The prospector, seeing the creatures drawing closer, dropped out of the tree, made his way to his canoe and escaped them. He said he had no doubt that had he not seen the creatures moving toward him, he might not have lived to tell about it. In 1905, indigenous cannery workers, being terrorized by an unknown being, refused to return to work for an entire season and would not do so until the company pledged to have armed guards protecting them 24 hours a day. Under that premise, they returned the following year. In 1920, a man named Albert Petka, who lived on his boat near Naleto, claimed to have been physically attacked by what he labeled a bushman. His dogs drove off the attacker, but his injuries ultimately proved fatal. He related this story before succumbing to those injuries. Sometime in the 1920s, more stories began to circulate about the odd happenings around Port Chatham. One referred to a large hairy creature that walked upright like a human, often seen at the chromium mining camp. These were accompanied by reports of trees that had been ripped from the ground, inverted, and driven back into the ground with tremendous force, with their roots now facing upwards. In 1931, a logger named Andrew Camluck was found dead with blunt force trauma to the head from what was assumed to be a piece of mining equipment, a winch, that could not be lifted and swung by any ordinary man. As blood was found on the winch and Camluck was found 10 feet from it, it appeared it was used as a weapon to deliver a fatal blow to his head, and then simply tossed aside. Then there was the story of sawmill owner Tom Larson, who was out one day cutting wood for fish traps. He claimed to have seen a large hairy creature on the beach and left for home to get his gun. When he returned, the creature, still there, just stared at him, and Larson, for whatever reason, decided not to fire a shot at it. One strange disappearance involved that of a gold miner who left one morning for his panning area and was never seen or heard from again. By the 1940s, there were growing reports of literally dozens of bodies being found in trails and rivers and in some cases floating in the bay. The corpses were said to be mangled and essentially torn to shreds, but deemed not likely to be victims of a bear or wolf attack. Many were experienced hunters who would venture into the hills to hunt sheep and bear, only to never be seen again. Local moose hunters claim to have occasionally come across gigantic footprints, some over 18 inches in length, where the grass had been tamped down, suggesting a struggle may have taken place. The footprints would lead toward the mountains, where they would abruptly end. In 1949, with fear overcoming the basic need to earn a living, locals literally left the area seemingly overnight, in many cases leaving possessions behind. Without a population to serve, the post office there closed permanently the following year. Melania Helen Kell was just a small child when her parents quite suddenly uprooted the family and moved to Nanwaluk. Her parents had built a home on the beach at Portlock, and she described the land there as plentiful for growing crops and gardens and the diverse usage of its residents. Yet, out of the blue, as did so many others, they pulled their school-age children out of classes and left their homes not because of one incident, but the accumulation of events that posed a threat to them, mainly surrounding the repeated mysterious disappearances that were being attributed to a strange creature in their midst. Kell maintains that once the family moved away, they weren't bothered again, and for that they were grateful. But the sightings continued into the years ahead, each more bizarre than the prior one. One woman tells the story of her brother and cousin boating up to the lake and upon arrival tying off his skiff. He encountered a terrible smell coming from some bushes, so, perhaps thinking a dead animal carcass was the cause, he peeled them back to find the source. As he peered in, he saw what he described as a frightening-looking man covered in hair with his back turned toward him. Terrified of what they had seen, her brother and her cousin took off running and never returned there again. Want to hear an even weirder story? Well, here's an even weirder story. In August of 1973, 3 men were bow hunting goats and black bear when a storm forced them to take shelter in Dogfish Bay Lagoon. They landed their skiff and ate a dinner of broiled salmon before heading to their tent for the night. As experienced hunters, they left their fire burning and cleaned the pots and pans so as not to attract bears. Around 2 a.m., one of the men awoke after hearing what sounded like footsteps outside the tent. As the footsteps circled the tent, he was sure it wasn't a bear or anything on 4 legs. He squeezed the leg of the man sleeping next to him to wake him, and the third man already had a rifle in hand ready to fire. The steps were no more than 10 feet from the tent at that point, and all doubt was removed that it was bipedal. The men slowly exited the tent, flashlights in hand, but saw nothing, not even footprints. This continued the following night, and on the 3rd day, when the weather broke, they decided they had enough, and the now panicky men left the area. We fast forward 17 years to 1990, when one of the men was working as a paramedic in Anchorage. A call came in that a man at the state jail at Eagle River was having a heart attack. The subject was an indigenous man in his 70s, and after he was stabilized at the jail, the transport to the Native Medical Center in Anchorage began. While en route, the paramedic and the patient, an Aleut from Port Graham, engaged in casual conversation about their mutual interest in hunting. The paramedic told the man about the time he was weathered in at Dogfish Bay, without mention of any related encounter. The old man then sat up in his gurney, grabbed the paramedic by the shirt, pulled him close and said, "Did it bother you?" Knowing immediately what the old man was referring to, "Yes," the paramedic said. "Did you see it?" asked the old man. "No," the paramedic said. "Did you see it?" "No," said the old man, "but my brother seen it. I chased him." So what was it that struck such fear into the otherwise strong and independent people of Portlock? What, for all intents and purposes, drove them from their homeland? Was there a homicidal Sasquatch on the loose, or were the legends and stories of those who had met an untimely death so pervasive that they clouded even the rational mind? First, let's take a look at that Sasquatch angle. Reports and stories of Sasquatch became a cultural phenomenon in the mid to late 20th century, but their appearance in the Sigstun culture predates those. According to their legends, the creature they knew as Natanuk was actually a man and lived among humans, but grew tired of their presence and moved into the forest to isolate from them. His hair grew to the point it totally covered his body. Children were told at an early age not to go out on foggy days because that's when the creature would be most likely to be venturing about. There would also be a very strong pungent odor attributed to his presence. They were also to take caution about going into the woods, as this was his home, and if encountered, to display respect and friendliness while keeping distance from him. It was said that if pursued, he had the ability to shapeshift into a different animal, making it more of a supernatural being than one made of flesh and blood. Is this a unique phenomenon? Hardly. Not when you take into account legends through the ages from indigenous peoples of the hairy man or the wild man in their culture. Many native peoples across North America tell tales of mysterious creatures living in forests that have long predated contemporary Bigfoot phenomena. At the Tule River Indian Reservation in California, there are 500 to 1,000-year-old petroglyphs created by the Yukuts at Painted Rock that to some depict a group of Bigfoots they call the family. In Mississippi, the Natchez people tell stories of a hairy creature in the woods known to scream loudly and steal their livestock. The Iroquois speak of a hostile hairy giant with impenetrable skin known as the Atniahe, or stone giant, more commonly referred to as the Ganokskwa. So, as you can see, many indigenous people have stories of human giant-like creatures in their folk history. Many of them are given names that are translated in their language to be something along the lines of the wild man or the hairy man. It's said at the heart of every legend is a grain of truth, so you can't totally dismiss these stories because, after all, somebody saw something. In Portlock, for example, there were sightings of a creature long before the Patterson-Gimlin film or Finding Bigfoot came to TV. I believe in the possibility of Sasquatch, do you? That's entirely your call. The question here is, did he drive the people of Portlock away from their land? The answer to that is a bit more complicated. Essentially, the Russian Aleut people were nomadic, and their destinations would be influenced by seasonal weather and abundance of food sources. They may typically pass through Port Chatham, Dogfish Bay, Seldovia, Homer, or Kodiak. There are also perhaps more pragmatic and clearly valid reasons they may have just decided to up and leave. The shrinking economy, access to better schools, and the church. All were introducing a different culture than the one most people grew up in and had embraced. Their moving also coincided with the extension of Alaska Highway Route 1 to Kenai, and eventually Homer, which diverted much of the connecting traffic that would typically run through town toward a more sophisticated and efficient highway. Sadly, much of what is left behind is in a terrible state of decay now. Buildings are abandoned, and instead of shutters and curtains, are covered in graffiti. There are also ancestors who remain buried there, who did not accompany their descendants to greener pastures. So while the existence of a large hairy creature can be debated, many of the people of Portlock still maintain its existence. Finding documentation for missing people or murdered people is nearly impossible to find. The mining, fishing, and logging industries, those are three pretty dangerous professions. Accidents happen. We're not talking about a large population here. Some years it was no more than 30, so maybe they just kept it in-house. Stories of the Nantinaq were told as cautionary tales to children just to prevent them from wandering into the unforgiving wilderness. A version of the boogeyman will get you if you don't watch out. Because parents will do that. Murderous Bigfoot, hostile environment, dangerous vocation, or maybe just stories to keep interlopers away who are advocating cultural change, or just stories to keep kids safe. Those might play some role in this story. Perhaps for not quite the reasons most people choose to believe, Portlock's existence or lack of remains shrouded in mystery.